So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mike Pichak. I'm the Commissioner at the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation. And it's really an honor for us to present this webinar and an honor for us to have our guest speakers with us. And just to begin, I think it was really critical that we bring this topic both to the members of our department and the members of our industry as well, because I'm sure you feel it as I do. These have been unprecedented times. The last 9 months have been met with challenges, both personal and professional, that many of us never anticipated, and probably unprecedented in terms of previous professional and personal challenge we've faced. We're doing it all remote without the benefit of, the human touch and the human emotional benefit that we often get from being with friends and family, which has only added to the stress. And certainly when we watch the news and the daily goings-ons with our country, there's certain reason for heightened anxiety as well. So this was really an opportunity for us to discuss the ways that we can combat the anxiety, the fatigue, the stress, the burnout that we are all potentially feeling to some degree, ways that we can manage that, mitigate it, and move into 2021 with a fresh perspective, knowing that things are bound to get better in the year ahead, and that as 2021 proceeds, as the vaccines roll out, as the weather improves, all of those things will contribute to a much better position then than we are today, and things will certainly only get better. So I do want to introduce the two guest speakers that we have. First is Drew Anderson. Drew is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Albany. He's an active teacher and a researcher at the university, and he also maintains a part-time private practice in the Albany area. Drew's also been very involved in emergency services over the years. He's currently an EMT lieutenant and the director of behavioral health with the Denmark Bethlehem EMS. And he's also a fighter and a lieutenant with the Delmar Fire Department. Drew's going to be able to share a lot of techniques and strategies and experiences from his own experience, and look forward to hearing from him. We also have joining us Sarah Cioffi, who is a K-12 academic administrator at the Shenendehowa Central School District in Saratoga County, New York. She is the director of the Capital Region ENL Roundtable and the Capital Area League of Leaders, and is a co-director of the New York CLA Exam Consortium, and is also an active member of the New York State ENL Leadership Council and the Clarkson University Advisory Board. So very much my honor and privilege to introduce both Drew and Sarah, and we'll turn it over to them at this time.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. I am so happy to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah. I'll let Drew introduce himself in a moment, but we wanted to thank you for having us today and also let you know how great it is to be talking to our neighbors in Vermont about a very important and timely subject. So Vermont is a very special place to both of us. I actually was born in New York, but my entire family is from Vermont. My mom was from Barrie and my dad was from Rutland. And I also happen to be a UVM grad, so it's like a second home to me. Drew?
Hi, I'm Drew. I am, I think, one of the few people on the call that is not from Vermont or have any connections to Vermont, but actually through Sarah over the last several years, I've really spent a fair bit of time there and really love it. So I'm also really glad to be able to speak to you guys today. All right, so I'm going to start off here, and we're going to start just setting the stage a little bit. And the commissioner spoke about this a little bit, but COVID really has taken its toll, and in some unexpected ways. So, it's really thrown things, thrown us all for a loop. Some interesting. I'm going to throw some interesting sort of statistics out here at the beginning, but what I find interesting is there's been some recent research suggesting that before COVID, individuals working from home had lower levels of burnout than those working on site. But since COVID has happened, we've had a complete turnaround, and those numbers have reversed. So people now, anybody working from home feels higher levels of stress and burnout than people who are working on site. And we think this is because people just feel like that, before working from home was kind of a perk, and now it feels like an obligation, something we're stuck at home and have to do. And so also just every year, the American Psychological Association does a survey on stress in America. And this year they were able to do one related to COVID-related stressors. And so what do we know kind of overall? Almost 80% of Americans say the coronavirus pandemic has been is a significant source of stress in their life. And about 2/3 say that stress has gotten increased and gotten worse over the course of the pandemic. So it's not getting any better. We're moving in the wrong direction. And then, in work-related context, the majority of individuals say that right now job stability is a major source of stress in their lives. And, that over almost 70% say their job or employment has been negatively impacted because of the COVID crisis, across the board. So this is something that, as we all know, this is really affecting all of us.
So one of the things that we want to make sure everyone is really clear on is that COVID isn't the real problem, that burnout was around long before COVID, and it'll be here, unfortunately, long after COVID is gone. And so we sort of ask ourselves, who was really totally happy even before COVID, and who wasn't feeling burnt out and stressed out before COVID. So for us, if we focus exclusively on COVID or totally blame it on COVID, sort of miss the opportunity to do good work here. So the real problem is a failure to set limits. So today we're going to focus on this underlying cause, which is that failure to set limits. So this is really the primary culprit in work-life imbalance and burnout. So we have just a little over an hour. So Drew and I are going to focus in on the one thing that we think will give you the most bang for your buck. So a change, if you will, that can sustain you long after COVID is gone. And we really could spend about 3 hours with all of you today working through some of this information, but also really helping you in a lot of areas. But because we just have that short amount of time, that's what we're going to stick to today. We're always happy to come back and talk with you more or for longer if you find this helpful.
All right, so one of the questions some of you might be having is why us? Why should you be listening to us when we talk about stress? And just to give you some context, besides being a full-time professor, as the commissioner mentioned, I'm also in private practice. I see patients in Albany. My own professional and personal interests are in stress. I teach an undergraduate course in health psychology that involves a big component of stress management, and burnout. But also, besides those two paying jobs, I also have these two volunteer jobs as a firefighter, as EMT, and various leadership roles in those organizations that also take up a bunch of my time. So I'm as time crunched as anybody, maybe more time crunched than most. Also, just wanted to point out that emergency services have high rates of burnout, high rates of suicide even in them. So it's something that I am familiar with kind of across all those contexts, professional and personal.
And so I'm here and sort of got started in this work with Drew because I happen to be a school administrator. I do happen to work for a very large suburban district in Saratoga County, but I happen to also just be in a profession in general that sees very high rates of burnout and turnover. So school administrators, school leaders they see the 4th highest turnover of all other professions. Half of all new principals quit during their first 3 years of the role. 89% of school leaders say that they're overwhelmed. 85% of them say that they neglect self-care. So we know a little something about burnout and work-life balance.
And so I'd like to start, we want to start this off with a sort of a promise. And the promise is, if you kind of follow along, we're going to have some really concrete recommendations today, walk you through a couple of processes. Promise is, if you actually sort of follow along with this, do what we recommend, you're going to see really a significant and meaningful decrease in stress and an increase in your quality of life. And this is going to be both kind of professional life, but also personal life.
So here's how we're going to spend the rest of our time together this afternoon. It's a brief overview of what we're going to be looking at, again, really focusing on one particular thing that we think is going to be the most impactful for all of you. So we'll talk a little bit about burnout, exactly what it is and what it means. We'll talk about setting limits, both in theory and in practice. And then we'll talk about what I love to call buffers, interruptions, and fires, which will make more sense when we get into that in a little bit, and then recovery time.
Right. So let's start. We've been throwing this term around, burnout. I think we throw this term around a lot in general. So right now, what I'd like to do is have people in the, I believe the Q&A. If you did, type us out just a quick test. When I say the word burnout, when we talk about burnout, what do you think that term means? What does it mean to you? How have you experienced it? Just give us a little bit of that in the Q&A. And we're going to wait for some questions to pop up here or some comments. So we've got exhaustion. That's good. Total exhaustion, right? Absolutely, those are both good. Being overworked, tired and unfocused. Yeah, good. I think we're really hitting at this notion of real fatigue is a big component. We'll talk about that more. Unsustainable, very, really good. Lack of interest, overworked, no longer engaged. Overworked, not enough time to complete tasks, trying to do too much at once. Feel like cups overflowing, personally, professionally, emotionally, good. A lot of people saying exhaustion, hitting a wall, tired, and that's good. And not good, that's not good, but it's good.
Here's what's good though, is that folks can at least see that they're not alone, right? That this is hitting everybody.
Yeah, and I think that is what we see. You know, some of those statistics we threw up there to let you know that this is not, that you are not alone in this. This is incredibly common. And we've got more and more, can't separate yourself out, exhaustion. We've got no more energy. So those are some of those themes. So really what we see is that burnout is actually the end point of a long process. And just most broadly, what we see burnout is when your demands, the demands on you, demands on your time, demands on your energy exceed your resources. And over time, what we do is we kind of run through our reserves and we end up in this state that we call burnout. And so I want to point out there's no one event that causes us to burn out. It really is something that happens to you where you wear away and you wear away and you end up in that state. So I want to talk a little bit about what the science of burnout says. And so burnout's been around as a concept since about the late 70s. It was originally actually came up in the context of medical residents who were working these 100-hour work weeks, and they started to see these commonalities. And so this is what we've come up with over the years in terms of burnout. And so you'll see some of this you guys have already talked about. So the first component of burnout seems to be what we call, you guys mentioned a lot of physical exhaustion. We tend to focus on this emotional exhaustion. And what we see here is people start to show a lack of connection. They don't feel like that they are connected to their work. They don't feel like connected to the important areas of their life. We see this across the board. Then we see something that we call depersonalization. And for us, that really means that you don't feel connected to anything, and you don't feel good about anything. Right? And then we also see this decreased work-related self-worth, which is like it sounds, which is you can't even take joy in your work anymore. So if we see this kind of three main factors, you're tired all the time, you're emotionally exhausted, you can't care about things anymore, you don't feel connected to people anymore, or your work or otherwise, and you don't feel good about your job. What's interesting, again, to me as a psychologist, is that there's a lot of people, since burnout has come up as a topic, Some people have really framed burnout as being nothing more than a work-related clinical depression, right? Because as a psychologist, what do we see in our patients who are depressed? We see people who can't care about things anymore. Nothing feels fun or pleasurable anymore. They don't feel connected to other people, feel isolated. They don't feel good about themselves across the board. So we say this, I think there's enough differentiation between the two. We use different terms. Depression and burnout are slightly different things, but they're close enough that I want to say that this really has some pretty significant consequences, right? If we think about burnout being a really close cousin to clinical depression, that's something we really should be paying attention to, right? And there are costs associated with it, right? So the first one we want to get at is, even though burnout is related to a work-related context, what we see is a broad decreased quality of life. So this starts to spread from your work life into the other parts of your life. And we really start to see impairments everywhere across every aspect of a person's life. We do see decreased health. And some of these studies that have looked at long-term consequences of burnout, we see people more likely to go to the hospital, more likely to be sick. In particular, we see some issues with cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and things like that associated with long-term burnout. We also see increased substance use. And this is usually we see this in terms of alcohol use. I like to think of this as people who are burning out are starting to use inappropriate coping mechanisms to try to handle that stress and distress, right? So we start to see this besides substance use across the board. People are trying to feel better, and they're doing stuff that might not be healthy for them to do that. And the last one I put here, and I wanted to pull this out as an important one because it's increased marital or relationship conflicts. And the reason this is important, not only because it's a marker of other aspects of your life becoming affected by this, but also that, normally for most of us, we like to think about our spouse, our significant other, as a buffer against those other stresses and strains of our life. This is the person, sort of our refuge, person we can come home to, talk about our problems. And people who are burned out, not only do they lose that, but they start to actually have conflicts in that one area of life that might normally be something that would help them and buffer them. And then I did want to sort of talk about a little bit about financial costs. We do know that people who report themselves as being burned out are somewhere around between 2 to 3 times more likely to quit their job, basically, in any given year. And we also know there's some research that estimates that the cost to replace a person is about 1 to 2 or 1.5 to 2 times the annual salary. So this comes at a pretty big financial hit to any company, corporation that has high rates of burnout, right? Not only are you losing money, you're also losing the expertise and the sort of institutional memory of those people as well. Right. So that's just to set the stage a little bit in terms of why this is important. And a lot of you guys mentioned some things like exhaustion, that make us think that this is important. So let's talk about setting limits, because as Sarah mentioned, this is where we're really going to focus ourselves today. And so of all the things we could focus on, why did we choose setting limits as the thing that we're focusing on? Well, first of all, we're horrible at this, right? We are terrible, most of us, at setting limits. It is one of the biggest causes of stress and burnout. And feeling like you're not getting stuff done, feeling like you're not getting, you're having to work after hours, work on weekends, feeling like you're not connected or you're not doing your most valuable work, the stuff that maybe got you into the job you're in, that's incredibly caustic. And it just over time starts to eat away at you. So I like to say, this is the biggest bang for the buck thing you could do, right? If you focus on setting limits, that's going to be to cause the most increases in quality of life and decreases in burnout than anything else, single thing you could do. All right. So how does this happen, right? So the reason that we think people get burned out, or the main reason that we're going to talk about today, is they make a fundamental error in how we approach work. Right? So there are really basically only 2 ways you can get overworked and have poor work, right? So the first one is inefficiency. That is, you're just not great at your job. You're not efficient at your job. What should take you 2 hours to work takes you 3 or 4 hours to work, right? That can happen with some people, particularly if you're new at your job. But what we think of is that this is probably not the most important cause of overwork, right? The real culprit is this time-work imbalance. And so the way to think about it is you've got too much work for the time that you have. you got 12 hours of work to do in an 8-hour workday. And interestingly, there's a recent Gallup poll looking at employee burnout, and what they found is that 2 of what they call the main core causes of employee burnout are related to this work-time imbalance. One of them is what they call the unmanageable workload. Another one is unreasonable time pressure. So you see how both those factor in there to this time-work imbalance. And so I think many of us, and again, we're not in person, so I can't see people nodding along here, but when we start talking about work-time imbalance, people start to go, oh yeah, I know that. I know that experience of having 10 hours of work and 8 hours of work to do it in. Right. Here, so the problem, and so what do we typically do here, right? To solve this problem, right, we throw time at the problem, right? We start to add, this is where we say, well, I'll just stay a little bit after work today. I'll just work on Saturday. I'll just check my emails on Sunday afternoon, right? So we throw time at the problem, right? And one of our central things we want to say today is this is a horrible, horrible idea. It makes a lot of sense, right? But it is a terrible way to do things. And Sarah's going to talk a little bit about why. Sarah, you're still muted. You made the classic.
Mute myself.
All right, there you go.
Now?
Yep.
Okay.
One of the reasons, how's that? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So there are actually a couple of reasons that it's a really bad idea to throw time at the problem. One of the reasons is that every minute outside of work that you're working is a minute that you're not spending with friends and loved ones, right? So you're not doing the things that recharge your battery. And that can actually include resting, which we know, of course, is important. The other reason that it's never a good idea to throw time at the problem is because research has shown us that we really only have about 4 good hours of work in us, maybe 6. So it's not even good work when we throw too much time at the problem. So any guilt you might have about, not working on weekends or evenings, other than maybe occasionally, of course, right? We really want to encourage you to forget about that guilt right now. So this is really not about whether or not you love your job, right? We're going to assume that you all do. This is about building your capacity to do your job well. So none of the other work that you do matters if your job is not sustainable, right? So, or Drew often says to me, you end up throwing good money after bad, right?
Right. And so this is another key point we want to stress here is that some people, when we start talking about this, people are reluctant to balance their work and their life. And they do want to throw time at the problem because they feel like it makes them look good. It makes them look like a valued employee. It makes them look like a team player. But what you're really saying when you decide to work for free after hours and on Saturdays is you say, look, I'm willing to work for free. Look at me, I'm ignoring my kid's soccer game, right? Look how awesome I am. And it is not awesome to miss your kid's soccer game. And so one of the things we want to try to shift in a culture is that taking away this notion that it's somehow, again, this badge of honor to be overworked, exhausted, and work these 80-hour work weeks.
So I'm hoping you can all hear me because I keep getting a message that I have poor call quality. So, okay. So one of the things we want to start by saying is that as much as possible, when we start talking about really getting into the practice, sort of the practical side of setting limits and what that really looks like, is we want to start with the mindset that as much as possible, we have to be intentional with our time, right? We have to be relentlessly intentional with our time. So we have to learn to say no to things that are inconsistent with our mission. And that's really hard for us to do. In fact, I'm going to say it one more time. We have to learn to say no to things that are inconsistent with our mission. So at this point, I would love to invite our participants to tell us about your to-do list, right? So the question is, do you work from a to-do list? And so we would love to hear about your to-do list. Whatever you want to share about it is great. What does it look like, your to-do list? Where does it live? Is it electronic? Is it on paper? Is it Post-it notes? Is it all of the above? And so in the Q&A, if you would share out what your to-do list works or looks like.
So we've got email inbox, we've got Google Calendar, a long sticky note I can cross off and recycle, combination of paper pad, post-it notes, somebody doesn't have one, phone notes, notebook, check boxes, at home or at work, Excel, at home, notepad, to-do list app, sticky notes, in my head, emails, a couple people don't have them, a book called The Power List, it's a short list of must get dones every day. We got written lists, scrap piece of paper, post-it notes, too many of them, paper, reading them as they come in. So it sounds like we've got a pretty solid mix from nothing to paper to electronic to various versions of electronic and paper.
And so I'm wondering how many folks, when they're thinking about what their to-do list looks like, if they actually have more than one answer. So I will, full disclosure, I am sitting at a table right now. You can't see it, but I have a notepad. I have an electronic to-do list. I have post-it notes. So I am myself still a work in progress when it comes to the to-do list. But here's the thing that we want you to do with your to-do list. We want you to stop that right now. So if you do nothing else right now, and this might be one of the hardest things that we ask you to do, we want you to stop working from a to-do list. And here's why. And we're not suggesting that you don't have a to-do list. We're suggesting you stop working from your to-do list. Okay. And so why? So to-do lists are never ending, right? They're unruly. Again, you have some notes to yourself on Post-its, on notebooks, on Google Task Lists, on Outlook. And although it feels really good to check those items off of your to-do list, there really is a better way. And so here's a new rule for you. And that new rule is that everything goes on your schedule. And we mean everything. So the most productive people in the world work off of their calendars. And that's what we're going to ask you to start thinking about today, is how to work off your calendar. So when you consider your work life, everything has a time associated with it. That's how we want you to think moving forward. Okay. And partly because we want you to recognize the time cost of everything you do. So Drew's going to walk you a little bit through the actual process of that. Because we know this is not easy for everyone to wrap their brains around.
All right. Now, I noticed that a couple people in the Q&A note that they do use their calendar as their to-do list. So congratulations, you guys have a leg up on this process. For those of you who are working from everything from just in your heads to working from these various paper and electronic to-do lists, what I'd like for you guys to do, I can't see any of you, but if you have the ability and it's not otherwise taken up, to grab your calendar, grab a version of a calendar. And we want to walk you through this process kind of step by step, because this is going to be a little bit different depending on your actual job. But we want to give you this kind of overview of the structure, kind of the flow pattern of how to do this. And again, the idea here is to start to structure things to get you back that work-life balance. And that's kind of the underlying principle here, is that this process is one of the best ways we know and people have come up with to try to help corral that never-ending task list and that overwork that we see. So as we go through, the first thing we want to do is step number one is in this process is setting your working hours. Right now, some of you have, if you take out your calendar, some of you have work hours set contractually. There's so many hours a day you work on a given shift. But even within those working hours, there are different things, so even if you have set working hours like that, there are things that you do where you have some flexibility within those working hours, right? And as Sarah mentioned, we've probably got 4 hours of really quality work in us in a given day. This is across the board, across cultures. No matter how many hours you actually work, about 4 of those are really high quality hours, with maybe a couple more being good for a little bit sort of email and more kind of mundane tasks. So the first thing is to recognize that we are not invincible machines that can just work hour after hour after hour. You really have to set some hard edges on your work hours, right? Also, breaks are necessary, right? So You can't work straight from 9 to 5 with no breaks. I know contractually most of us don't do that, but we like to think in our heads we are these machines that can work without any kind of break. If there's a real emergency, if there's a meteor hits somewhere in Vermont and causes a massive disruption, okay, then we can maybe you can extend your working hours, right? But don't let these should be true emergencies, not these kind of fake emergencies that I got a lot to get done is not a true emergency in most cases. All right, so the next thing we want you to do is to start to think about obligations. And I want you to think about an obligation as anything that you have to do during a workday that is outside of your control. For a lot of us, those are meetings. Typically, they could be various tasks that you have to do, but the point is that they happen at a time that you can't decide. If you've got a staff meeting at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday, you got a staff meeting on a 9 o'clock Wednesday, you can't move that, but you need to account for it. There is sometimes this tendency to not count things like meeting as real work, but it's taking up time in your workday. As Sarah said, everything has a time associated with it. It's one of the main reasons for working off a schedule. You recognize that if you're in a half-day meeting, that's a half day you don't have for anything else. So schedule those obligations first. Again, just because we have to work around the things that you don't have control over. Depending on your job, this may be more or less percentage of your day. Right? So then the next thing we want you to do is schedule recurring tasks, right? And we think this is something or anything that happens in your day that's a regular part of your job, but you have control over when it happens. You may not have control over whether or not it happens, but you do have some influence over, when you do these things at, 9 a.m. or at 4 p.m. or something like that. This includes email. And if working from a to-do list or not working from a to-do list is one of the main shocks to a lot of people, email and thinking about email as a recurring task is going to be a big shift for a lot of you. Many of us, maybe most of us, we don't treat email like a recurring task. You treat it like an ongoing task. So of all the recurring tasks in your day, email is probably the single biggest interruption that happens to us every day. And it's one that most of us do horribly. I'll ask you guys, I'll take a couple seconds here, who here has some sort of announcement on their phone or on their desktop that lets them know when they have gotten a new email? It's turned on. It dings in some way. You get a pop-up, you get a ding. Who's got one of those? Just a real quick yes or no. I know we got a little bit of a delay before we can see the responses. Some of you may have several of them, depending on your devices. I do, we got yeses, all right. Yes. I'm scrolling through. I'm 100% yeses right now. Oh, we got a silent pop-up. All right, that's still a distractor. Unfortunately, yes. Oh, we are at 100% still. Yes. Oh, turned off noise. Oh, we got a no. Finally. I don't know if someone just said that to make me feel good. I turned my phone off. That's one. So here's the problem with this. If you treat your email like an ongoing task that's happening continuously, every time you're in the middle of work and an email pops up, we are hardwired as human beings to what is that? Some new piece of information, and it pulls us out of what we're doing, takes us away, and grabs our attention. And there's a whole bunch of research that suggested that it takes time. You're getting focused on something else, and what you're in the middle of doing is now gone. And when that email is over, even if it's just a momentary check, you've got to refocus your attention, get back onto that task. It is one of the biggest time wasters of modern life, is this constant shifting of your attention from task to email to task to email, back and forth over the course of the day.
And it's interesting. Drew and I have talked about this quite a bit. We feel like we could do whole workshops just on email. We could probably spend a couple hours just talking about that. And that's really across industries. Doesn't matter, what kinds of folks we're talking to and what professions. Email tends to be something that we all struggle with. And besides just that distraction, right, that constant dinging that pulls you away from the tasks that you're trying to complete, you also have to think too about how email can sort of derail you too, right? So you've got different kinds of email, right? You got the quick deletes, you have sometimes the bigger issues, you have smaller issues. But then once in a while, you might have one of those emails that can really sort of derail your whole day, right? It might be something that comes up that needs to be taken care of right away, or even just emotionally, it can be something that really throws you off for the day. We've all received those emails, right? And so we do often talk about, digging in a little bit more to email, but then we think about, how did stuff get done before there was email, right? Before it became sort of the standard tool that we use in the 90s. So we'll move on to our next step.
All right. So to stop to kind of see where we were. So you kind of set your work hours in terms of I'm not going to work after, 4 p.m., 5 p.m., whenever, if that's contractual or not. You've set that idea of you got 4 to 6 good hours in you. Some of us have an 8-hour workday, but that includes things like lunch and some breaks in there. So after that 4 to 6 hours, we've kind of set our meetings, our obligations, set over some of the other regular recurring tasks like doing email. And then the rest is, and so, by the way, I think we probably should say this, the way that we want you to work with email is as a task. You set a time to do your email, right? So that might be 1 or 2 times a day. That's the way I tend to work. I tend to quickly scan it over about 10 minutes at the beginning of the day, and then set a time a little bit later in the day to actually work through those items that need working on. That's how I do it. But the one thing we want to get you away from is constantly checking email, right? Each of you in your jobs may need to do this maybe more than once a day, but you shouldn't be doing it continuously. There should be a discrete amount of time, 10 or 15 minutes, maybe it's a half hour. Maybe if you work a lot out of email, it's 45 minutes, but set a time to do that and don't do anything other than email during that time, and don't do an email during other periods of that, or during other times. So what does that leave us? So we've set all those times up. Basically, you look at the rest of your day, and that's what we would call your discretionary time. Right. And so think about this, what goes here, right? And this is what's left of your job, right? So this is outside of meetings, outside of some of those time obligations. These are often for us. This is maybe the stuff that you love to do, or the bigger ideas you want to work on. Some of maybe if you got a job with some creative components to it, this is where we do those kinds of things. Normally, again, if we were in person and we were like having you work through your calendar as we do this, what people often discover is once you've kind of set your edges of your work, once you set in those obligations in those meetings, once you've set in your recurring tasks, there isn't a lot of time left over, right? There's not a ton of free time. This can feel like, a little constricted, right? But this, the point of doing this and the point of following through this is reality, right? The reality is if you have only a little bit of time here, you've got to say no to other things, right? This is to go back to what Sarah was saying, right? This right here, when we get to the step, is where people start throwing time at the problem. Right? They start to say like, oh, I've still got like 4 hours worth of work to do, but there's only an hour left in my schedule for the day. This again is exactly when we start to throw time at the problem. We start to say, I'll work a little later. I'll work on a Saturday. I'll come in on a Sunday. You have to be relentless, absolutely relentless with scheduling your discretionary time and stopping when your step 1, your working hours are over. Sharp edges is something I'll say time and time again. We talk about this a lot. You've got to cut this off and fit everything into that time.
And sort of just reminding you again that everything that is not crucial to your mission is where you have to start saying no. So we want you to be thinking about in this discretionary time, what is your stuff? What is the stuff that goes in there? And so we'd ask you to consider this for a moment. And then we also want to acknowledge that we know what you're thinking, right? So, and that's this. So what about the unexpected stuff? So you've gone through all these steps and you've scheduled your email and you've scheduled the things that you're obligated to do, like your meetings, and you've even scheduled some of your bigger picture things that you love working on with your discretionary time. But then, as we all know, that often the course of a day doesn't go exactly as scheduled or as planned, right? So a lot of times our days look like this. In fact, I had one of those days today, if I'm being really honest. And so that's what brings us to this part of our conversation, and that is the buffers, interruptions, and putting out fires. And I like to call this segment, hey, you got a minute. And so I think most of you know exactly what that is, right? So that's your boss, that's your employee, that could be your colleague, right, who stops in and says, hey, you got a minute? And this is something else that happens across professions, right? And we know full well that when someone says, hey, you got a minute, it's never really a minute, right? And so we also know that there's always something, right? So regardless of, what your role is or what your profession is, there's always something that can derail your day. And so this next thing that we want to talk with you about is sort of how to account for those unexpected interruptions in your day. And so at this point, we would ask you to go back to your schedule. And again, if we were with you in person, we would really sort of dig in deep to your calendars and your schedules and do this with you. But we want you to go back to your schedule, and we want you to think about adding the following 3 things. And so these are the things that will address the buffers, the interruptions, and the fires. Okay. And so let's start with transition time. So transition time is the buffers. And so be thinking about what transition time is for you. And if I can give you some examples, it might help you to start thinking about what that is for you in your workday. And we'd ask you to throw into the Q&A what transition times you have. So it could be transitioning, back from your lunch hour. It could be perhaps you're someone who has to travel, right, between different locations. And so you have to build in that transition time to work. So we'll take a moment and ask you to throw into the Q&A what transition time means to you. What are the things in your day that require that?
And Sarah, I know you can't see this. We had a really good question about having to immediately answer emails. That I think we can get that and some of the other questions at the end. So whoever wrote that, I saw your question, and I definitely think we want to take some time to answer that. But we'll collect some of those for the end.
Great, I made a note of it.
Phone call, transition to starting deep work on a project. That's a really good one, right? Many of us it takes time. You don't just jump straight in and get focused. Phone calls. I'll say for the person that said it, as an academic, I have to put a buffer time of takes me 15-20 minutes to really be able to get into kind of that deep work, that kind of more thoughtful stuff. Time to get from one meeting to another, even if virtual, right? I think something that's happened is, nobody's even got time for a bathroom break because they just assume you're going to instantly switch from meeting to meeting. So, when we were in person, that was walking down the hallway. It takes time, right? But, taking a minute to stand up and stretch, trying to transition to work time during the wake up. Absolutely.
So I'm going to encourage folks to just keep throwing some thoughts into the Q&A, but I want to take us to the next bullet point, which is the idea of setting office hours in your calendar, right? And so these are supposed to sort of address the interruptions that happen in your day. And so certainly in our lines of work, office hours are much more common. Perhaps you wouldn't even refer to it as office hours, but we suspect that there are things in your day, and typically, frankly, it's people, right? It could be, again, a boss, a coworker, an employee, who does that interruption. Hey, you got a minute? Hey, can I, talk to you for a moment? And so we'd ask you at this point to share with us in your world, what are the interruptions to your day? Who are the interrupters, if you will? And you don't have to name anybody by name.
The idea of office hours, by the way, comes out of, again, our work, particularly my work as an academic, as a university professor. For those of you guys who were in college, that I'm required to set office hours where my door's open. And when it's my office hours, if you have any kind of question, come see me. But if it's not my office hours, I can say, listen, I'm working on other projects right now. I don't want to see you. Now, obviously that's different if it's a boss versus a coworker, but the idea here is to set specific times that you are available for discussion and reserve some of those other times for doing other things. So we've got, we do have boss, coworkers, kids, right? The kids is a new one for many of us. I may or may not have been interrupted by my pets sometimes. It's hard to do office hours with a pet.
And I think the other thing too that's really important to say here is, you know, Drew and I share this with people often, that, you know, the open door policy is sort of the death of productivity, they say, right? And so although that seems counterintuitive, you know, we want to have an open door policy. We want people to be able to stop in and ask us questions whenever. We don't want to appear as though we're closed off or that we're not willing to collaborate. But the problem is that the open door policy has led to interruptions that prevent us from A, getting our work done, and B, really focusing on the person standing in front of us. So one of the ways that we find, you know, helps people to set those office hours without feeling sort of that guilt of, you know, feeling like they have a closed door policy is just reminding people that when they set time with you on a schedule or on a calendar, it's because you don't want to be distracted from what it is they're trying to say to you. So it's your promise to them that when they speak with you, you're going to give them your full attention. You're not going to be distracted by email because that's in another point of your day, right? You're not going to be interrupted by, you know, phone calls and things like that. So that tends to be a way for people to really recognize that your time is important, but their time is also important, and you're acknowledging that by setting that specific time for them to talk with you. Yeah. And then I guess, Drew, did you want to throw something out there?
Somebody wrote in the Q&A about messaging in Teams as being a kind of virtual interruption now. I agree. I have Teams on my clinical practice. We run a Teams that is running live while I'm seeing patients. What have I done for that? I've actually disabled all those alarms as well, and I check it in between patients on a regular schedule. I would say that kind of interruption, I like to work that almost like an email. It's just a different version of email. Unless there's something live where you have to do, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later, that you can treat that like a task like you would email. So I check it periodically, but not continuously.
I have actually taken to letting people know if I'm running a meeting, I'd let them know that they're welcome to add to the chat, but that I won't be looking at it except in certain points of the meeting. And if I don't get to the chat, I will try my best to copy and paste it and respond later. But, you know, I have felt this, and all of you probably have as well. I certainly know teachers are feeling it, that the chat has become sort of the passing of notes in class, but we're doing it right in your face. And it's incredibly distracting, right? It's another one of those things that pulls you away from what it is you're trying to say in that meeting. And so finally, we come to the last thing that we're going to ask you to schedule. And this is something that a lot of people don't think about, but it tends to be really, really helpful. And that is chaos time. So you're thinking about scheduling your transition time. You're thinking about now scheduling office hours to minimize the interruptions that interrupt the, you know, sort of the continuous work you want to do. But then there's chaos time. And so chaos time is the fires. Those are the things that you know, that come up. And so, you know, unexpectedly. And so what you want to try to do is schedule a certain amount of what we call chaos time right into your schedule every single day. And so chaos time is kind of like reserve time to make up for the time lost due to chaos, right? We recommend that you do this toward the end of your day. Okay, so if urgent matters come up, or meetings run over, or phone calls run over, which inevitably they will do, or you have for example, an interruption of internet service like I've been having all day, some of the stuff that you would plan to do earlier in the day is going to go into that chaos time. And if you don't use your chaos time, which I can promise you will rarely happen, but if you don't use that chaos time, now you have a chunk of time that you can go back to thinking about the stuff that we talked about earlier, the things that you really wanted to work on that you're trying to fit in your day that you don't have a lot of time to do.
And I'll say, just Sarah, as we're transitioning here, someone wrote a question about their job is to be available to staff at all times, so their day is full of interruptions. If you can use a version of chaos time there, and something we could talk to whoever it is that wrote that. If they're interested, we'll have our contact information. I'm happy to talk to you a little bit more about how to do this. If your job is such that you've got a lot of those interruptions, you can use kind of a version of chaos time where you set aside, it's almost like you know that there's going to be fires every day, and so you set aside some blocks of time to handle interruptions with fairly minimal amount of breaks, or you can work across staff members. There's actually some really good examples that come out of the world of computer, the world of computer, system administrators and things like that, who do have to deal with a lot of interruptions, and they've come up with some really novel ways to handle that. Because some of their job is really just fire putter outer is what they do all day long. So if you do have that task, get in touch with us at the end, and we can walk you through some of that, because I do think that's a specific thing that we can help with.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is really important to note, that's why we acknowledge that the amount of chaos time you need in your day will definitely depend upon your job. And so for some of you, your job might be actually, helping other people during their chaos time, right? And helping to put out their fires. We often talk with school leaders, principals, who say that, they have a set schedule every day, and one fight or one incident happens in the building, and now everything's out the window, and that time is completely lost. So we recommend to school principals that they have much more chaos time built into their day. And then other folks find that they don't need that much time. They just need some time toward the end of the day for smaller interruptions. So I don't think I asked people to share what some of the fires are that would require them to build chaos time in, but I would love for them to share in the Q&A. Drew, if you want to. Yep. So what are the things that are your fires? What, for what do you find that you would need chaos time?
So by the way, while we're waiting, the person that said that said if they have critical things, they block their calendar and go offline. I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about that as just sort of chaos time. Someone else, by the way, asked if we'd be able to show a calendar example at the end. And so if we have time, I know actually from another thing, Sarah does have an example of her calendar. It's related to an academic job. Request from the governor's office. That's a fire. Look, request from any kind of boss, like, drop everything and get this done. For many people, that's the fire of the day. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and let's also recognize too that sometimes the things that are the interruptions, the hey, you got a minute, those actually turn into the fires that require a good chunk of chaos time.
Right. So, as we sort of kind of make our transition here, people often have this schedule. They're looking at this, they're kind of despairing and saying, well, what if it doesn't fit? What if I've done all this stuff? I've added my buffers, you've got me adding chaos time, and it doesn't fit. I've still got, 2 more hours of work to do in my, I've only got X number of hours. Well, something has to give, right? The way most people do is they give of their personal time. They give of their own discretionary time. And this is what causes that work-life imbalance, right? This is what, we can't hammer this point home enough, right? You have to be ruthless with your edges, because again, that failure to set those limits is what's causing that burnout. It's what's causing that long-term problem. And here's a money example. It's like you're making $1,000 a month, but you're spending $1,200 a month. Everybody knows that at some point, you finish, you kind of empty out your savings account. You max out your credit cards, and at some point, there's nothing left to spend. You go bankrupt, right? We all understand that from a financial point of view, but we don't understand that from a time point of view. All of us are willing to spend the equivalent of $1,200 in time, even though we're only making $1,000 in time. And that, like we've said from the beginning, that's the real underlying cause of burnout, right? So if it doesn't fit, you got to do something to try to make it fit as much as possible. Right. And so we've just given you a couple of examples here of things you can do. Some of the things you can do is try offloading some tasks. Some people have administrative assistants, secretaries that can do some of their work. I know that some of us were reluctant to give them tasks. but the idea here is to take some of that time that is really keeping you away from those core missions and keeping your work-life balance in balance. Anybody else that can help with that? You can also renegotiate obligations, particularly meetings. If there's one thing we've learned from COVID, it's that many of the things that we thought required an in-person meeting for several hours don't. We've gotten, I think, a little more efficient sometimes with that. So what we want you to do is take a hard look at everything in your day and see if some of it, and again, depending on your job, you have more or less ability to regulate this, can renegotiate some of those things as well. All right, and so again, we know this is what we've given you is a simple process, right? It's a simple 4-step process, 5-step process here, but it's not easy, right? It is not easy. We understand the difficulty of doing this. The problem is that it's necessary, right? Your body does not understand that you've got to work 8 hours, 10 hours, and you've only got 6 hours in which to do it, right? You have to make the hard choices. And that's what we're saying to people. This is the hardest step in the process. It's not complicated stuff. It's just really difficult stuff, right?
So that brings us to our discussion of recovery time. And the really important takeaway here is that recovery time is non-negotiable. We like to say you should never eat lunch with one hand, right? So if you think of lunch as recovery time or a break, right? But you're reading emails while you're eating, that's actually not recovery time. That's just you giving up your lunch while you're still working, right? So remember that, never eat lunch with one hand, right? So this is like exercise. So if you need time when you exercise, right, for your muscles to recover, or what ends up happening if you don't, you injure yourself. So recovery time during your workday, recovery time on a Saturday, right? Think about your day, think about your week, think about your month and how you're going to fit that that recovery time in, right? We want you to stop thinking about Sundays or Saturdays as satellite work days, if you will. Okay, so most email, for example, let's talk about email again. Most email can wait until Monday. We often have people tell us that they like to read email on the weekends because they don't want to face it when they go back to work on Monday, right? And we understand that, we do. But remember too that the stressor is not necessarily just the number of emails. It could also be what is in those emails. So if you end up getting one of those emails on the weekend and when you're just trying to catch up on email to make Monday easier, you might find that the content of that email actually interrupts your ability to relax for the rest of the weekend, right? So we recognize that it's not easy, and it becomes this trap where you're trying to make up, some of your work on the weekends. And so we recognize that it's not easy, but reading emails or doing work on the weekends is really sort of fraught with peril, right? So one of the things we'll talk about is sort of this onboarding process on Mondays, right? So if you schedule time on Monday morning to do the work that you don't want to face on Monday, that allows you to really have that recovery time when you have your weekend. So remember, never eat lunch with one hand. So I'd ask you to take a look at this for a moment and think about this. And I have definitely been a victim of this, before, right? Getting stuck in that really weird cycle.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this the recovery time in the context of work-life balance, right? The whole point here is that this should be the time that you are recharging your batteries, right? And so many of us have heard this. I don't know if anybody's ever heard this phrase. Life isn't a sprint; it's a marathon. And I hate this. I hate this absolutely. I get why people say it. The idea is, think long term. But the problem is I think the marathon is a horrible metaphor for our lives, and here's why. Right? I want you to think differently. Life is not a marathon; it's a series of sprints. Right? This is a fundamentally different way about thinking about your day and recovery, because this is what a marathon is. right? Having run a couple of marathons, you start running, you keep running. It's stress, unrelenting stress until you collapse across the finish line, right? The problem is that unlike a marathon, most of our lives do not have a collapse across the finish line, right, the same way. And it just leads to chronic burnout, no sense of recovery here. If you think of this other way of looking at it, of your recovery, and this is is that you should think about stress recovery, work, relax. Instead of thinking of these giant blocks of days or weeks of unrelenting work, schedule in recovery. This is what gets you back into work-life balance, right? So alternating these periods of stress and recovery. And here's the fundamental thing to think about. If you've got a little stress in your life, you just need a little recovery. If you've got really big stress, you can need big recovery. You have to balance those things, right? So if you've had a particularly hard work week, you might need a little bit more deep recovery than you might if it was just a couple easy days, right? Take a little bit of a break in the afternoon after working really hard all morning. Take an extra 5 or 10 minutes. You have to make these sort of equivalent doses is the way to think about it. But I said this earlier, we are not machines that can't recover. We are not machines that work without breaks until we break down. Right. So just really quickly, I like to get geeky and be the psychologist in me here is that recovery in a nutshell, right? We have two stress systems in our body, the sympathetic nervous system, that's that fight, flight, or freeze system in our body. We also have what's called the HPA axis, which is more related to chronic stress. So when we're stressed, those systems turn on. Recovery, we actually switch on a different system in our body called the parasympathetic nervous system. And what happens is, so all recovery does this, no matter what you do to recover, you are doing something along these lines. You are taking those stress hormones and fight or flight hormones, and you're turning them off, and you're turning on that recovery and bringing yourself back to baseline. Right. The point is here is there are a million ways to relax and recover, right? I'm not going to tell you what you need to do to recover. You know you. What we suggest you do is you use your subjective experience as a guide. It should feel like recovery, right? So sometimes we get these people who are really kind of the work hard, play hard people, right? They think that they work hard for 8 hours and then they go out and they play really hard. That is actually not true recovery. That's just a different way to get exhausted, right? So you should feel, when you're done with your recovery, you should feel refreshed. You should feel energized. If you're not, either it wasn't the right type of recovery or wasn't enough or something like that. But use that subjective sense of well-being and quality of life to guide you. We would take a little bit of time to kind of talk to you about what your ways to relax are. I know we're running a little bit short on time, so we might want to just we can talk a little bit about that in the questions and answers. But what we want you to do is think about now, where does this fit in your workday? So remember, you can't work 6-8 hours straight, right? Many of us have mandated breaks. They're there for a reason, right? So where can you fit short periods of recovery? Taking a 15-minute walk at lunch with your friends, or going outside for a little bit, as long as we're not in the middle of the winter or a snowstorm like we're about to get here, right? What can you do to intersperse your periods of work with little periods of recovery during the day? And in the bigger sense, where does this fit in the rest of your life, right? This is weekends. This is, Americans are horrible about taking vacation days. We don't take them, right? Why? Because again, we don't want to look like we're lazy, but what we're doing is we're not recovering enough, right? And after a big, long period of work, you might need a week or two. That's why they exist, right? So thinking and very explicitly putting in recovery periods into your life is, again, one of the biggest things we can do. Everything else up to this, we were talking about how to manage your work life. This is how to manage that balance of the rest of your life.
So as we wrap up, and we know we've thrown a lot at you in a very short period of time, we want you to really think about this. And this is the most important notion, that managing work-life balance and setting limits are the most important things we can do to manage stress and reduce burnout. So when your work-life balance is under control, everything gets better, right? You can get more sleep, you can spend quality time with your loved ones, We often joke saying, you know, maybe you can even fit in that yoga class that you've been longing for, or maybe you won't even need that yoga class anymore, right? And so here's another way to be thinking about what we're proposing to you. And so we also recognize that this means that you might need to make some really hard decisions, right? But we would also propose to you that you're probably already making some really hard decisions. You're probably just making them in the wrong direction, right? So you're already agonizing over this, right? That's frankly why you're here. So you're making the decision to not really be present at your kid's soccer game, right? You're making the decision to be on the phone when you're with your family, right? This is hard stuff. This is behavioral change and an attitude change and a lifestyle change. And we all know for sure how challenging those changes can be. And doesn't that describe so many of us, right?
All right, so somebody in the chat or question and answer brought up the idea of what's the most efficient way to break old work habits, and I'm going to say this is kind of a start, right? We're going back to our promise. Give us 30 days, right? Try this out for 30 days. Start to really do that process we told you. Set those edges on your workday. Set those categories in your workday, that kind of workflow process, and make sure that you're very deliberate about your periods of recovery. And you know, it takes about 30 days. You're going to see a really noticeable change in your stress level and in your quality of life, right? The thing is, you need about a month or so to work the bugs out. Most of the time people will try doing this and stuff just isn't quite right. They need to adjust the amounts of their buffer time or their whatever time. But it takes about a month. You can always go back if it turns out it doesn't work, right? You can always go back to the old way of doing things. So if you want trying to set a new habit, you know, put this stuff in place and then just say, I'm going to take the next 28 days, you know, 4 work weeks or whatever, to put it in place and see what happens.
And remember too that we've really shared with you sort of one overarching strategy, right, which is setting limits. And we've talked about some of the different ways that you can set those limits. So when you think about, remember to schedule your chaos time, right? Remember to schedule your email time, turn off your email notifications. Remember your to-do list, right? So we're not saying throw away your to-do list, we're saying don't work off of them. So take those to-do lists and what is on those to-do lists and schedule that time in your workday. And so you've got lots of sort of practical strategies to kind of get you started for those 30 days. But just also, I would say Drew and I are also always willing to come back in, check in on how you're doing, help reset your focus, and also share with you even more strategies besides just setting limits that might, you know, sort of help you out. So we'd ask you to consider this. And then we have one final question for you before we talk about some of the questions you might have if we still have time, and that is, what's one change you will make immediately? So of all the things we've discussed with you, what do you feel is the one that you can wrap your brain around, that you can make right now, that you can sort of embrace, and, you know, starting tomorrow or starting Monday, you can change? So I'd love if you could throw your thoughts into the Q&A. What's one change you think you can make immediately?
And as we're waiting, I know we had one more question about someone asking, would you suggest a drop and drag scheduling process for emails? If you have a system that will work that, I like that. I personally like that. I think that helps you sort of say to move it, because several of you said you work out of your email. And I think that Outlook in particular, I think, is good at that. You can pretty easily learn to set a task so that it's got a you can turn it into something that has a time associated with it. So we're getting responses, recovery time, not working after hours, email time starts tomorrow. That's awesome. Using your calendar, turning off email notifications, setting recovery time, scheduling buffers, interruptions, scheduling lunch away from the desk. That's a great one. I'm not always great at that. Build in recovery time, putting a buffer between meetings. So those are some of those really good things that you guys have said. Turn off email notifications, check email periodically, putting in work time in my calendar. Yeah. We got another email another thing for email here. Those are the things that when we've done this in other places, these are the ones that many people say are the things that have a huge impact that you can start tomorrow. Moving the to-do list to the calendar. Somebody wrote actually taking a lunch. Some good ones like that.
And not in your car.
Right. So this is, someone actually asked for an example of a calendar. I don't know if we have enough time because we're bumping up on time here. But if someone, we can put, these slides are going to be available. We'll actually add a slide with our email addresses on there, as well as some other references for you guys who want some further reading on this. And we are happy to work with you, with anybody who has a question. Sarah's got a great example of her calendar as a school administrator. I've got an example as somebody that works 2 different jobs. One as a clinician, one as a college professor. We will absolutely help you out with that. And maybe we can include those in the extra slides. Nick has said we'll add those to the slideshow and post it on the website so you can see a couple of our concrete examples of what that actually looks like. Yep,
absolutely. I'll share an example of a calendar a week where you can see that I was really great about building in email time and chaos time, and then I sort of fell apart toward the end of the week. Again, still a work in progress, but we'll be sure to share that in there, along with the resources that Drew mentioned, because all of our work, it comes from research that's been done and lots of reading on the topic. But there are lots of resources out there too that you can take a look at that might also be really helpful. Any other questions, Drew, in the Q&A?
Oh, someone said thank you for pointing out this is not only related to COVID. That which is, I think, again, a really good point, because if this were true in 6 months, we'll all be happy and running through the fields, and there'll be no stress in our lives at all if it was all COVID.
So again, we will share with you our email address and our email addresses. So if you want to reach out to us directly, we encourage you to do that. Otherwise, we really want to thank you for your time today. We hope that you're able to rebuild and recover over the holidays, although we know that that's not always easy to do. But at least you have some good strategies for the new year that you can implement and get started with right away.
Yeah, and Sarah and Drew, I just want to say thank you so much for spending the time with us, for providing us your really concrete and helpful advice and game plans for reducing stress, and I think thereby reducing anxiety and many of those other challenging emotions that come with stress. So really appreciate it, and really appreciate everyone that spent some time with us this afternoon. I hope you found it valuable, and do encourage you to reach out to Drew and Sarah if you have any follow-up questions or needs. And with that, I want to wish everyone a very happy and healthy and safe holiday season, and look forward to speaking with everyone very soon.
Great, thank you. Stay safe, everybody.